I'm Sally Burke, a former president of the DC Preservation League and a 4 decades preservation activist in Washington. I've known Richard since 1985 when he arrived at George Washington University to chair the preservation program. At that time, he had already published 2 or 3 books before the age of 40. At the Edge of the World is one of my all-time favorite books, and he went on to eventually publish at least a dozen more books. With his CV at that time, it was anticipated that he would be an excellent professor. He did not disappoint. But he not only taught. Prior to meeting Richard, my years of study had exposed me to many professors with impressive credentials, most of whom took teaching quite seriously and performed well in the classroom. But Richard was the first and only professor I've had who took his responsibility to teach beyond the classroom. Each semester, he took his students on a field trip to a city that provided an excellent canvas for the study of preservation. Charleston is the one that I remember the most. That was so exciting. In addition, he held salons at home. I suspect that when GW hired Richard, no one anticipated that he would be an extremely effective preservation activist in Washington. And it is this, more than anything, that has bonded us. For several years, Richard chaired the Historic Preservation Subcommittee of the Committee of 100 on the Federal City. In that role, he dealt with every citywide preservation issue that came before the DC Historic Preservation Review Board. His years as chair of the Committee of 100's Preservation Subcommittee coincided with my years as president of the DC Preservation League. Together, we worked to unite the two organizations to become one voice for the preservation of a city that was experiencing rapid change. This was in the 90s. In the ensuing 35 years since he arrived at GW, he has participated in the designation of possibly 100 sites. Some of them, like Mies van der Rohe's Martin Luther King Jr. Library, are obvious candidates for preservation. Others, like the Park and Shop in Cleveland Park, open people's eyes to the value of vernacular sites. Washington is a better city for Richard's preservation activism. But what is little known, or possibly unknown, not realized, is that Richard rescued the careers of many female preservationists. Always a strong advocate for his students, he was sorely tested by a tenured professor in the American Studies program at GW, who entertained himself by harassing female students. The other professors in the department, all male at that time, chose to turn a blind eye to the harasser. One of them even said to me, when I reported the harasser to him, "Oh, Sally, grow up," but not Richard. He was the new kid of the block, yet he marched himself into the harasser's office and confronted him with, "What are you trying to do, destroy my program?" And with those words, Richard saved the preservation program at GW and the careers of dozens of female preservationists. It's been more than 3 decades since I graduated from GW, yet my relationship with my professor, rather than fading with time, has grown stronger. No longer officially his student, I continue to learn preservation activism from his example. It is my pleasure, as the 2015 recipient of this award, to introduce the recipient of the 2020 DC Award for Lifetime Achievement in Historic Preservation, Richard Washington Longstreth.
I guess part of my instinctive nature is to be especially interested in things that a lot of people say, why is that significant? and to show that it is and why it is, and to change people's thinking.
Richard Longstreth has combined his passions for architectural history and historic preservation into a career that has spanned more than 40 years. Born in Pasadena, California in 1946, his family soon moved to the East Coast. The son of an architect, Richard found an interest in architecture by his senior year of high school in Middletown, Rhode Island. He would choose to pursue a degree as the next step.
My criteria for college outside of academic standing were that it would be large, it would be urban, and it would be co-ed, not necessarily in that order. I got accepted to both Columbia and Penn, and asked the college advisor which he would choose, and he said Columbia, so I said, good, I'm going to Penn.
Majoring in architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, Richard would find a passion for architectural history during his studies. After graduation, having been in the NROTC, he was placed on active duty and deployed to the Asian continent. Upon his return, he was stationed at the Pentagon and would meet his future wife during this period in Washington.
So I had decided when I was still in the Navy that I couldn't be both an architect and a historian at the same time. There was virtually nothing that I didn't like in the pursuit of architectural history.
Richard would go on to receive his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. It was there where he would really begin his involvement in preservation. After teaching at Kansas State University, he would join the faculty at the George Washington University in 1983.
There was a good complementary faculty at GW, as well as some of the best and the brightest for adjuncts.
He's very old school, and I mean that positively. He's kind of got a goodbye Mr. Chips gloss with his students and other faculty members. He's a very admirable fellow, a man, as we say in the Victorian age, a man of many parts.
After taking his first year to develop a curriculum, Richard would find himself pulled into the preservation battles of D.C. He was asked to help save a Cleveland Park shopping center from demolition, the Park and Shop. It was one of the first shopping centers in the United States with drive-in parking. The demolition permit would eventually be pulled, and the owners would end up selling the property to a new developer, Douglas Jamal.
Eventually, Doug Jamal stepped up to the plate toward the end of it. Douglas was very, forthcoming. He said, everything you told me I couldn't do, I realize now I shouldn't have done. That helped. It makes it a better project. How many developers are ever going to tell you that? And it was the beginning of a lifelong friendship with Douglas, and by his own admission, got him into preservation, which I think has been the city's good fortune.
The Park and Shop designation would lead Richard to write several books on the subject of retail architectural history.
It's unusual to find someone who has great standing in the scholarly realm, but also in this case, in the practice of historic preservation. And I think that attracts students, and I think it attracts other practitioners on either side of the game to him. It gives him great standing. There are not many like Richard in that.
Other preservation projects would follow. The old Greyhound terminal on New York Avenue had been slated for demolition. The original building was an example of classic Art Deco architecture. The concrete and steel structure had a facade consisting of Indiana limestone with glazed black terracotta coping. But during the 1970s, the facade was covered with cement cladding. Preservation groups staged a protest to draw attention to the building, in the hopes of restoring the facade to its original design. The building would eventually be designated an historic landmark.
He was an invaluable resource to preservationists all through the city and far beyond. Buildings that would otherwise have been obliterated will live on after our time to teach and to be enjoyed by our children and grandchildren, hopefully. That's quite a legacy.
Historic preservation, and read Richard Longstreth, gives you and me and everybody else a treasure to enjoy: the light, the air, the space, the visions along the long planned streets. And so he was enormously, I can't emphasize how enormous his contribution was.
Richard also helped with saving the Sears Roebuck & Company department store in Tenleytown, the Woodward and Lothrop building, the Hecht warehouse, and many others.
It's wonderful to, just walk or drive by a building and say, it's still here, it's still, and it's in wonderful condition, and it's sought after by many people, and it could easily have not been.
Richard has been a vital part of preserving the historic fabric of the district through his preservation victories. And through his scholarship and inspiration to his students, he has helped to ignite a passion in the next generation of preservationists.
It's not just the process of working on the protection of buildings and districts and the like. It's also trying to spread the impact of that on new ways of thinking about the built environment. The day before of a recording which I am now making, we learned that in a little over 2 months we will have a new President of the United States. This turn of events gives cause for many Americans and many others in the free world to rejoice. As a people, we have had the good fortune to elect leaders who have guided us successfully through crises. Abraham Lincoln in 1860, Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, and through much of World War II, Dwight Eisenhower during some of the worst years of the Cold War, John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which could have ended in nuclear holocaust. We are fortunate now to have someone who can work to heal the fissures of society and who can protect and regenerate the core values and institutions that have been the bedrock of our democracy. As a collateral descendant of the first president of the United States, this makes me particularly pleased. We moved to Washington in 1983 so that I could assume the responsibilities of directing GW's graduate program in historic preservation. I had lived here for a single year while in the Navy in 1970-71. My wife is a sixth-generation Washingtonian, about as rare a species as one could find. The past 37-plus years have been wonderful and very rewarding ones. I have had wonderful students and terrific colleagues. One cannot teach preservation unless one does preservation, so engaging outside of the academy has been essential. But it has also been intellectually very rewarding as well as enjoyable, leading to numerous new friendships and productive associations. There are too many people to thank for all of this over the years, and I am, of course, deeply, deeply honored to receive this award. Many members of the Committee of 100, where I have done much of my work, only a few can be called out here, but certainly Anne Celine, with whom I had worked very closely and who did me the honor of submitting this nomination. Dorn McGrath, a colleague at GW, and also chairman of the Committee of 100 for many years, Tersh Boasberg, likewise with the Committee of 100, who also directed was chairman of our Zoning Commission, our Planning Commission, our Historic Preservation Review Board, and founder of Preservation Action. Con Hitchcock, with whom I worked very closely with the Woodward Building, and other cases, Laura Richards on many occasions. Pat Tiller, an old friend who, once he retired from the Park Service, became very active in the committee and with whom I worked very closely, especially on the Smithsonian South Quadrangle. Charles Robertson, Sally Burke, a former student, one of many wonderful students I've had over the years. Loretta Newman, Eric Hine, another wonderful former student. George Idelson, the late Anne Hargrove, and many, many others. Thanks also go to Rebecca Miller, under whose direction the DC Preservation League has become a force majeure in Washington. And also I want to thank Penny Jones, with whom I worked a number of years ago. Certainly to David Maloney, another distinguished former student, and his staff at the Historic Preservation Office, and members of the Historic Preservation Review Board. I particularly want to cite Charles Cassell, who is always very on point in his remarks, and James Spate, who chaired the review board when I first started to get involved, a man of great integrity and of great devotee to good causes across the city. We're very fortunate to have a strong nonprofits, strong preservation office, and a strong preservation review board, which has made the always challenging tasks of historic preservation much easier and much more successful. I also want to thank the late Carter Brown, with whom I had the privilege to not to collaborate, but to work with on a number of occasions, and as secretary of a commission, the late Charles Atherton, and of course currently Tom Lubke. Members of the City Council, Phil Mendelson, who's very able chairing of the council, has been of immense benefit to many things that go on in Washington, and who's been a great friend of good preservation and good planning. Former members, including Jim Nathanson and the late great John Wilson, who used to encant that Washington is the most livable city in the United States. Something, even when the city was in some of its worst crises, he was a rock, and I think he was very much on target in his remarks. And to many other individuals, Richard Striner, from whom you have heard, with whom I worked on the Greyhound Bus Depot and the Heck Company Warehouse, and other projects, Kathy Wood and Judy Hubbard with the Cleveland Park Historical Society on the historic district there, and especially on the Park and Shop, to the late James Good, another great friend and a great contributor to our knowledge of Washington history, Washington architecture, to Douglas Jamal. Again, you've heard from him, and we first worked together on the Park and Shop, and his embrace of historic preservation in that project has led, of course, to many others, not the least of which the Heck Company Warehouse, which is really a model of adaptive use. And finally, to the many, many wonderful graduate students I've had over the years who have gone on to have distinguished careers in the academy, in the preservation field, who are working from as far to the east as Croatia and as far to the west as Australia, as well as throughout the United States. I still stay active in preservation with the Committee of 100, with the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy, on whose board I sit, with the Fort Ticonderoga Association. I'm also on that board, with Adirondack Architectural Heritage, with Falling Water, and other groups on which I serve in an advisory capacity, as well as with our National Historic Landmarks program. I have found there is no more interesting and rewarding path to take than that which I have had the good fortune to embark on. Thank you.